they genuinely were fearful for their daughters in particular.
Definitely. And at the same time as them being fearful, they're also wanting to elevate the family status by hiring a music master of good standing. So you've got two things going on. You've got, on the one hand, well, we've got to hire the most lucrative and the most popular Italian music master, because Italians are the ones who are on the stage and who are particularly popular, and we want our daughter to get the best education. And then at the same time, well, what if they engage in an inappropriate relationship? What if she's carried away by his fanciful voice and his fanciful teachings?
Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of Amorous Histories. I'm Annie Harrison, your resident history nerd, and today I also have a special guest joining me, Dr Brianna Robertson-Kirkland. Thank you to everyone who has supported me with social media follows, likes and shares. If you're new, hopefully you'll like what you hear and help spread the word. If you haven't already found my social media pages, I'm at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook, and at Amorous Histpod on Twitter. You can find the transcripts and the sources for each show on my website, amoroushistories.co.uk, and if you like your podcast available on YouTube, I've caught up with myself and uploaded every episode to my channel, which is also called Amorous Histories. If you're enjoying listening to me chat to myself, and apparently quite a few of you are, then please do leave me a review or some stars wherever you get your podcasts. Brianna is a lecturer in historical musicology at the University of Glasgow and has a particular interest in the field of historically informed performance and 18th century studies. She completed her PhD research on the 18th century Castrato singer Venanzio Rauzzini and his students. Brianna is a research associate for the AHRC funded project, The Edited Collection of Alan Ramsay, and is research assistant for the Royal Society of Edinburgh-funded Romantic National Song Network. She was also part of the team who established the Royal Society of Edinburgh-funded 18th Century Arts Education Research Network. She's on the board for the British Society of 18th Century Studies, the music editor for B-Sex Critics, and she's also the publicity officer for the Women's Studies Group 1558 to 1837. Somehow, whilst doing all of this and more, she wrote her book Venanzio Rauzzini and the Birth of a New Style in English Singing, Scandalous Lessons, which was published at the start of this year. Welcome, Brianna. Thank you for joining me on the Amorous Histories podcast.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of your podcast. I listen to it all the time. It's really great.
Thank you. It's a little bit mad that people keep telling me that they're listening to it, and I'm like, why? So today we're going to be talking about the scandal or potential scandal surrounding music and singing lessons in 18th century Britain, and the general public's fear and fascination with castratos such as Venanzio Rauzzini, who is the star of Brianna's book. Before we jump in, I just want to explain what is meant by castrato. These were male singers who were castrated before puberty so that they maintained a vocal range that could hit the high notes, unlike uncastrated male counterparts or women. Castrati were not the same as eunuchs, who were typically castrated after going through puberty. It was possible to be a natural castrato, whereby the lack of testosterone is because of a hormonal imbalance, instead of the crude and illegal surgical intervention forced on many young boys in previous centuries. Because of their unique singing voices, castrati became highly sought after musicians in Europe, with certain roles being written for them in operas and other performances. We'll learn more about them throughout the episode. So, with definitions taken care of, Brianna, can you tell us the main way in which music was consumed in 18th century Britain?
So music was consumed in a variety of ways, as you might expect in 18th century Britain. One of the main ways was through the opera. So operas were incredibly popular, and they weren't restricted to courtly performances as you might have found in other European countries. Instead, we had several London theatres that produced Italian opera, so they brought over Italian singers to come and perform in the opera. And we also had English opera as well, which became very popular in the 18th century, which satirized initially Italian opera. And what I mean by that is that it made fun of Italian opera. And then it became more professionalized as the 18th century went on. And that kind of opera developed into things like Gilbert and Sullivan's operettas, which some listeners might recognize. So people would have consumed it that way. They also would have consumed it at pleasure gardens, where you would have heard singers and instrumentalists performing in the gardens in the height of summer, or in concert halls. So Bath Assembly Rooms regularly held a concert series that Venanzio Rauzzini, who we're going to be talking about today, he was the director of for many years. And they might have also purchased sheet music and played it in their homes as well. And so that was another way that if they saw songs that they really liked or pieces that they really liked, then they could go and purchase usually a more simplified version that they could take home with them and play on a suitable instrument in their home.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So music wasn't just consumed by the middle and upper classes. What sort of role did it play in the lives of each class? Working class as well would have been they would have been exposed to it in different ways, like the theatre or, walking along the street, as you say. What sort of role did it play in the lives of 18th century people?
Well, this is one of the frustrating things of when we're looking at those who are in the lower rungs of society. It's difficult to know exactly what they were consuming, although I have absolutely no doubt that they were engaging in music, that they were singing songs with one another, potentially learning them from balladeers who might have been walking up and down the streets of Edinburgh or London and singing ballads and then selling the ballad sheets that they might want to perform. These tended to be very, very cheap, so something like a penny, especially in the early 18th century. And the more middling sort, so the middling rank of people, they would have been the kind of people who had been playing in their home. They would have some disposable income where they could purchase an instrument, say like a keyboard instrument, like a spinet, or eventually a piano or a guitar or a harp. And then they'd be playing some of that music in their home. They'd also have to have enough disposable income to hire someone to come in and play with it and teach them how to play. And depending on how much money you have to spend will depend on the quality of that person that comes in to teach you. And then when you get into the upper ranks, aristocrats, royalty, then they're going to have the cream of the crop music masters coming in and teaching probably daily lessons so that they're getting enough expertise on how to play a variety of different kind of music. And they are typically going to be playing still in those similar kinds of domestic instruments, so pianos, guitars, harps, things that you would typically accompany someone with. That would be an appropriate instrument for a woman in particular.
So you'd have appropriate instruments for women and appropriate instruments for men?
Yes. So appropriate instruments for women tend to be accompanying instruments. Appropriate instruments for men, a little harder to narrow down. They did play accompanying instruments, but you wouldn't typically find a man doing that. Typically, he might play the melody instrument so that the woman can accompany him and they can engage in a little bit more close proximity to one another than they might otherwise be allowed. And of course, this all has to be very carefully managed, so they would never be allowed to do that without some kind of person overseeing their activities.
You never knew that music lessons could be so naughty.
Exactly. That's exactly what I get into in my book.
So I'm really interested in where the fear of scandal in music lessons comes from, because, as I said, until we connected, I never considered it as being a possibility. Is it just that it's the one-to-one tuition, or is there just scope for scandal wherever there's music?
It's partly to do with the private sphere of that one-to-one lesson. So I'm just talking about there that music is used as this kind of courting opportunity where a man and a woman, and this is them just playing together, we're not even getting into the master territory yet. It allows them to be in close proximity, to engage closely with one another in other ways, that in another way other than, say, dancing, which is similarly close proximity and similarly an opportunity for courting. But the music lesson in particular, that's where you have a music master who's coming into the home, typically. We'll get into other kinds of people who can teach as well, but a music master typically coming into the home and being in a private space with typically a young woman. And there are all kinds of novels that talk about romantic relationships, inappropriate romantic relationships developing between that young lady who's usually from a wealthy family and the lowly music master, who's typically foreign as well, which is not always great in these novels, who's trying to steal away her virtue or trying to lull her through his music into engaging in a relationship that she might not otherwise want to engage with, or isn't a nice relationship that her father would want her to engage in. So we've got novels that are really exaggerating that. But then in newspapers, you also get accounts of real life singers who have been in relationships with their music masters. So Elizabeth Billington is one example. She becomes a hugely famous opera singer at the end of the 18th century. Almost everyone would have known her name at that time. And she married her music master. So her husband had been her music master, and they got married she was relatively young. She was about 17, 18 years old when they got married. And it all blew up in the press a few years after she became famous, where Richard Ridgway, he wrote this memoirs of Mrs. Billington that claimed that their relationship was clandestine, that she had run away with her husband to get married, and that the parents had disapproved. And actually, if you look at her marriage certificate, her mother was present, and then her father and brother went with her to Dublin immediately after with her husband to play in the theatre band, and they were engaged as a family, like in theatre. So I'm quite skeptical at how much scandal really surrounded that relationship. But it emphasized this idea that singers and being taught by your music master was in some way going to lead to an inappropriate relationship.
Yeah, definitely hearing those echoes of fear about upper classes and lower classes coming together, and the fear of interrupting lineage, like the lineage, sort of pure lineage. And the same with the fear around migrants is obviously reflected in quite a few sort of fictional things from, throughout the 18th century, that fear of the class, the upper class almost being diluted in a way as they would see it, and the fear of sort of especially Europeans coming in and sort of having all these different skills and different interests and being almost more attractive than like the British man, because they can offer these things that you've not seen before, and it being very much a threat. It's quite interesting.
Yeah,
so I was looking at your the cover of your book, which has got a Thomas Rowlandson illustration on it from Comforts of Bath, and it's the music master, which I'll put on our social media for all of our listeners. But that was, a couple of drawings that Rowlandson did showing a music teacher and a pupil in sort of closer than they should be, and in particular the Comforts of Bath, the music maker, has the male teacher and a female pupil embracing, whilst I believe it's her father is asleep in the armchair with his back to them. And there's a whole other you've got Bath and that being a place of all of these things to explore, and sex and naughtiness and music, and then you've got the music teacher there in a private room exploiting access to the young woman.
Yes.
And I think that's really interesting, that it was a widespread fear. It's not something like that we sort of look at retrospectively and we go, oh, they must have never been scared of that. But no, they genuinely were fearful for their daughters in particular.
Definitely. And at the same time as them being fearful, they're also wanting to elevate the family status by hiring a music master of good standing. So you've got two things going on. You've got, on the one hand, well, we've got to hire the most lucrative and the most popular Italian music master, because Italians are the ones who are on the stage and who are particularly popular, and we want our daughter to get the best education. And then at the same time, well, what if they engage in an inappropriate relationship? What if she's carried away by his fanciful voice and his fanciful teachings? What do we do about them being in close proximity in a private room together? And it seems to be that there's a lot of difficulty in people being able to reconcile those two ideals of having the Italian music master that's the most desirable person to teach, and also having their young daughter with this man in a private room.
Yeah, tricky one to navigate. So who was it delivering the music lessons? Was it primarily men, or did women sometimes deliver them as well?
So you can get female teachers as well. In fact, one of the attractive options for middling rank people to train their daughters in music was because it gave them a profession that was considered respectable if they didn't have a husband. So if they could then become a governess who had some music teaching ability, or they could become a music teacher. And at the turn of the 19th century, this becomes particularly advantageous. So there's one person that I work on called Anne Young, who she didn't marry until quite late in life. She was in her 40s by the time that she got married. And she made a living for many years by working as a music teacher, and was very well known as a music teacher and very well respected for it. And then she stopped working once she got married. So you could get that, but it wasn't always thought of as the most lucrative or the best to have a woman teaching you. Usually you might have a governess teach you for a short amount of time, and then if your father thought that your skill could be developed further, or that you could enhance the family by having a music master that was more respected or well known come in and teach you, then at that point they would pay more money and they would hire someone like Rauzzini to come in and teach. So you often see adverts for the more lucrative music masters such as Rauzzini, catering more to the wealthy end of society. What's unique about Rauzzini is that he also teaches a number of professionals, which is a whole other ball game. So people who are aspiring to become professional opera singers, and he teaches them in a very different way, or he offers them something that's quite different, where he's not going into their home to teach necessarily, but they're working with him in a much more apprenticeship kind of process. So coming with him to the theatre, singing with him in concerts, singing in his concerts. And in a couple of occasions, there's two male singers who come and live with him at his house, and seem to engage in more regular singing tuition, as well as taking part in his concert series.
So Rauzzini was castrati.
He was a castrato.
Yeah. So would people tend towards hiring castrati because they saw them as maybe less of a sexual threat for some reason?
Well, castrati are an interesting bunch. At the beginning of the 18th century, they're highly sexualized, and they're very much feared because they can have a relationship with a woman and no one would know unless you actually walk in on them in the act. Because if they get up to naughty business, then there's no pregnancy that's going to result from it. So there was a lot of fear around that. And Farinelli was a very famous castrato at the beginning of the 18th century who sang for Handel. There was a lot of articles in the newspaper that was painting him as this kind of sexualized character who's going to run off with all of the ladies in England. Rauzzini is painted in a very similar light, where he is thought of as this singer who is highly sought after, highly attractive, and that he can engage in a relationship with women. And what do men in Britain do about this when they're not going to be able to find out if their wife or their daughter is ended up in a relationship with this castrato? There is one occasion where this lands Rauzzini in a bit of hot water, where in a divorce proceeding with Elizabeth Gooch, who was an upper class woman, she apparently had this letter from Rauzzini that was written in florid language that seemed to be suggesting that they were in some kind of relationship, according to her husband, and that her husband found this letter and he was so angry that at that point he said, right, we're going to separate and I'm getting a divorce from you because you're clearly engaged in a relationship with your music master, which is Rauzzini. And she denies all claims. She denies it for the entirety of her life. She wrote 2 memoirs. She told all and still denied that they ever had a relationship. And in the divorce proceedings, what actually comes out is that Rauzzini wasn't necessarily the one who wrote the letter. She seemed to have written a letter to Rauzzini that was had been writing inappropriate language to him, and that was the trigger letter that had resulted in the divorce. But of course, she doesn't tell it that way in her memoir. She says that the letter came from Rauzzini and that was perfectly innocent. It's just his florid way of speaking. Now, we never hear Rauzzini's side because he keeps well out of it. He does not say anything. And Elizabeth Gooch has an excuse for that. She says he relies on the public and he cannot voice an opinion because if he does, that might put his reputation in bad standing. And we will never know exactly if that was true or not, or if Rauzzini was just trying to keep well out of it because he didn't want to be involved in this divorce that he had nothing to do with, or if there was maybe something going on between them that did, in fact, actually end her marriage in the end. So it's an interesting story that does actually represent kind of the difficulties of being a music master and being a castrato and being Italian in the 18th century, where he ended up in a scandal that he may or may not have had anything to do with, and yet it's just by implication that he's been involved.
And I think that, as far as I'm aware, that follows him across Europe, that he perhaps was involved in several scandals, maybe really, maybe not, and that's how he ended up in Britain.
Yeah, so Michael Kelly, who was one of his pupils fairly early on, Michael Kelly also wrote a memoir long after Rauzzini's death, about 10 years after Rauzzini's death, and he claimed that Rauzzini came to Britain because he had been involved with someone in the court in Europe, and that he had to scatter out of that court in Munich very, very quickly, and that he ran all the way and he just stayed in Britain for the rest of his life. This is actually categorically untrue. Rauzzini, at the time when Michael Kelly is claiming that all of this happened, was singing in Italy at the time, and there is a proof, there's a paid contract that he was singing in Italy. He did not scatter out of the court in Munich. His contract ended at Munich. He went and he sang a few different operas in Italy, and then he came to Britain, where he was engaged in the opera in Britain. So what Michael Kelly's actually doing is he's playing into this idea of the castrato as a scandalous figure to sell his memoirs.
Yeah, just to sell books. Much more exciting if he's fled Munich embroiled in scandal than it is if he was just pottering around Europe and ended up in Britain.
Exactly. But what better way to sell books?
Exactly. Scandal sells. So I was interested in whether parents were worried for their sons as well as their daughters when in regards to scandal in music lessons, because obviously when it comes to women, there's loads of things to fear or chastise for, less so with men, especially in regards to performance, because men on stage is nowhere as near as scandalous as a woman on stage in the 18th century. So would it be absolutely fine? They wouldn't even pop into their head that something inappropriate would happen in between master and pupil for their sons?
If there was ever any fear, I certainly haven't read about it or seen any evidence to suggest that yet. I'm sure that if something had happened, that would be a very big deal. Obviously, this is a time period where any kind of same-sex relationship had to be kept very much under wraps, because there was a real threat there at this particular point in time. Now, that said, when we're talking about middling or upper class gentlemen getting music lessons, It does happen. It's a little bit rarer than women. There's not that same kind of emphasis. Usually they are encouraged to like spend more time on proper legitimate studies. But there are plenty of men who take an interest in music and they develop skills, whether it be so that they can court a young lady or whether it be that they're just happen to be interested in music. There's plenty of men who are interested in that way. And there was a couple of men that Rauzzini did train, but there's never any discussion, never any call that he was involved in anything untoward with these men. As I said, there was 2 tenors who lived with him and there was never any question about what they were getting up to. So I think it's the situation in the 18th century where if there is anything untoward that is not going to be mentioned, and certainly I haven't found anything, that doesn't mean to say that there isn't something out there. I'm sure if I dug a little bit deeper into court cases that there might be things that pop up that perhaps weren't discussed in the newspapers.
That's an interesting thought, actually. So I was reading about the fear as well, the fear of castrato being attractive to both men and women, and then you just, there's so much going on. They're foreign, they do music, they're attractive to men and women, they're just one big threat in the eyes of certain people. So that I feel like that could be a really interesting possibility, that if you know the words to look for as well, or the places to look in regards to those sort of relationships that had to be underground and couldn't be seen by others. That's an interesting, maybe one day in the future that we'll find something like that.
I think we've just come up with a new area for research. And the sad part about the castrato is that most of these men who were castrated ended up living very lonely lives, especially in their elder years. They're not permitted to marry. There's only one castrato called Tinducci who did marry, and then that marriage was very quickly annulled. So they don't have that kind of long-term relationship that they can engage in openly. And in Rauzzini's case, the family that he has is the singers that he trains and who want to keep coming back, but they grow up, they live their lives, and there's no one at the end really for Rauzzini. Although I say that 2 of his pupils, which is Nancy Storrs and John Braham, they both erected a memorial to him, which is still standing in Bath Abbey. And John Braham was the chief mourner at his funeral. So it seems that these 2 pupils in particular remained by his side and remained kind of devotees to Rauzzini, but they're not blood relatives. It's not the same as having a long-term romantic relationship with anyone, which is just not a possibility for Rauzzini, at least not openly.
I guess then if you wanted to dig even deeper, you could go in and say, well, if he's castrated, does that make every sexual relationship sodomy? Because he can't have children. It's not sodomy in the same way that 2 men having sex is, but if you're going to be sort of by the book about it, it's not procreative sex, it is sex for pleasure, and that is also a massive threat, because heaven forbid we should encourage anyone in the 18th century to be having sex for pleasure. That's not the done thing.
Exactly. And this is a part of the issue of the problem of the castrato, and the problem of the castrato in the British male eyes typically is that he can only give sex for pleasure, if he can even give sex at all, because no one talks about whether they can or cannot. And 2, it's, well, if they can only give sex for pleasure, well, then they can't get married, they can't have because they can't provide a woman with a child, so which means they can't have an open long-term relationship with a woman. They absolutely can't do that with a man because that's illegal. So there are all of these problems with the castrato by the very nature of the operation that he had to undergo, which most of these men had undergone that operation before they probably even realized what that meant.
not through choice either. It was sort of something that was pushed upon them.
Yes.
And so thinking a little bit more about theatre, would people have associated singing lessons in particular sort of with the naughtiness of theatre and the naughtiness surrounding actresses in particular?
Absolutely. So there's actually a couple of satiristic plays. One is called The Music Lesson, which is all about a well-born lady who ends up in a situation of falling for her music master and her dancing master, and another man who's brought in by her father, and then she ends up marrying the footman. So there's plays that are going on like that in the theatre that would have made the link very strong. But then, as I said, there's also female singers. I was going to say actresses there, because actresses kind of fall in the same boat as well. But female singers who are also, they're spread across the press for all of their scandals that they end up in. And sometimes their music masters end up getting hauled into these discussions as well. As I said, Elizabeth Billington, her husband had been her music master initially. And then you get other kind of accounts of music masters being abusive towards their female students, who then end up as professionals later, and they sort of tell all, as it were. So there's all of these kinds of accounts that are coming out in the newspapers, and they can be really quite raw and really quite salacious towards these women. Elizabeth Billington, I mentioned that memoir by Richard Ridgway that was really bad on her character, really down on her character. And he in particular mentioned that she had this relationship with her uncle, which was, she had actually been raped by her uncle, and this was a tried court case when she was particularly young. And he was using this as an excuse of, well, that she has been tainted since she was but a child. And it's like, well, the reality of that situation is that her uncle was a musician. Not exactly sure if he was training her or not, but they were in a private situation, and he's taken advantage of a young girl. And then her parents have actually taken that to the point of going to court and getting this man tried, and he was found guilty in the end. So there's those kinds of situations that are happening as well, and that was used against her in these memoirs as evidence of her scandalous activities.
It seems like it's a very thin line in between being an accomplished sort of young woman who can do all those things, who can play the piano and can dance and sing, and being an actress or a prima donna. Is it possible to quantify that? Is it just, if you perform in private, it's slightly more, it's respectable, but if you perform in public, then you're putting yourself out there, and you shouldn't really be doing that as a woman?
Absolutely. So the split between the private and public sphere is very prominent. In private, you can play, you can sing, you can engage in courtly behaviours, and all of that is fine because it's behind closed doors. The reality of the situation is that your parents are hauling you to parties, and you're expected to play whenever invited to play, and there could be tens of people, it won't be hundreds, but there could be quite a lot of people in a room like waiting for you to perform at will. The difference though is that a professional female singer, she's performing in public, which means she's using her body to make money, and that's where the line is. The implication is that if she's using her body to make money, then how else is she making money with her body?
Yeah, and it's almost like if A, she starts singing, B, she starts singing on stage, C, then she's a prostitute. It's just that sort of black and white almost in the eyes of men and women as well, but those who don't sort of understand it. That's a really interesting take on something that just never would have thought of before. I understood singing in theatre as being very much something that was public and was done on the stage, and that actresses were there, and they were sort of seen as being lewd or lascivious, and then you've got your sort of almost like Jane Austen young lady playing a piano, singing a song, and it's all that, you know, it's all very pure and done privately, and then but the scandal in the music lesson is almost bringing the two together in a way that I hadn't really anticipated.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's this kind of the problem of the private sphere. So it's happening behind closed doors, which in some ways might seem safe in certain circumstances because it's not happening out for all the public eyes to see, but then no one knows what's going on. So there could be activities going on that no one really appreciates or wants, and it's all the speculation about what could be happening in that private space.
Yes, and speculation, I think, is probably one of the best words to sort. Like it encompasses so much. You've got the fear that comes with the speculation, and then you've got all of the possibilities of what they could be doing. You just don't know because you're not there. You're in the next room, and that sort of fuels it almost. The not knowing is definitely adds fuel to the fire.
Definitely.
So we have unfortunately run out of time. That was so much fun speaking to you. So yeah, just thank you very much for joining me, Brianna. It's been fascinating to talk to you about Scandal in the 18th century music room. Like I said, I've never thought of it before. It's completely new to me, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why I started this podcast, is so I could find out things that I didn't know and just sort of add them to the pointless list of knowledge in my head.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have been able to come on to your podcast, which is a wonderful listen, and I'm so pleased to be able to share my research with yourself and with any listeners who might be interested.
Thank you very much. So if any listeners are interested in finding out more about Brianna's research or any of her many projects, you can go to her website, which is Brianna Robertson-Kirkland.com. So that's BriannaRobertson-Kirkland.com. And her Twitter handle is @BrieRob_Kirk, and that is BREEROB_KIRK. And her book is available to purchase either as a hardback or an ebook. And I would fully suggest that if you are a student who is at uni, lobby your library to buy it. So wonderful. Thank you very much. Zoom is now telling me off because it says I've got less than 1 minute to go.
Thank you, Brianna, for being on the podcast. If you like this episode, please leave Amorous Histories a review or some stars on your podcast app or website, and let me know if you want more interviews. You should be able to find me wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. You can also follow my socials at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook, and at Amorous Hist Pod on Twitter. Transcripts and sources are at amoroushstories.co.uk. You can also follow my socials at Amorous Histories on Instagram and Facebook, and at Amorous Hist Pod on Twitter. Transcripts and sources are at amoroushstories.co.uk. Please feel free to DM or email me at amoroushhistories@gmail.com if you have any questions, episode suggestions, or want to collab. Next episode will be the last of the season, but fear not, I have a few things planned for in between. So until then, remember to stay sexy.